Hey guys, Tony Rowe here, doing something a little bit different. Something I haven't done on my channel yet, in fact. I'm going to be reviewing a game. Not my game. I don't really play real games. I'm lazy like that, but I'm going to review a game that was played today in the U.S. Championships between J.Xiong and Kamsky. So, if you've most people are probably familiar with Kamsky, who is black, and we're going to follow the game from black's perspective. Perhaps you'll see why in a second. If you guys are not familiar with Kamsky, he's Soviet-born, but ever since he was a kid, he lived in the United States. And in fact, I think he actually lived in Cleveland, where I'm from, for a little while when he was younger. And he's a five-time U.S. champion, an absolutely world-class player. I think his peak rating was in the early 2010s, and he crossed 2750, 2760, 2770, something like that, and has been in world title contention in the candidates or the knockout systems quite a few times. So he's absolutely world class. He's a little bit older now. His rating has fallen under 2700, and I think is in the 2600 somewhere. But of course, a guy like that is always going to be a tough opponent. And white is J.Xiong, and I think J.Xiong is 15, so he's incredibly young, has shot up the rating system, and I think now he's just a little over 2600, maybe 2610 or so. Probably a little higher USCF, maybe 2650. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. Someone who was professional would have looked up their ratings, but I didn't. And this was in the fifth round of the U.S. Championships. It happened today. I was a little under the weather, stayed home from work, and I watched this game live. And really an absolutely magnificent game from both players, I think. So one well worth checking out. And after we see Zhang's opening move and Kamsky's opening move, we'll see why I was really interested in studying this game further. So this is an Alekhine's defense. An opening that I'm really getting into lately. Very fun to play. Very uncompromising, provocative. And Zhang played d4, which is the main line, and Kamsky replied with really the main move, the only move. Some people try to get tricky and play knight b6 here, but d6 is traditionally the move. And yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, the position after c4, knight b6 sort of reveals black's intentions here. So black has given white two free tempi with e5 and c4 to kick this knight to the b6 square, but in doing so, black is hoping that white's center is going to prove overextended and weak, and black will try and generate a lot of counterplay based on attacking these pawns. So Zhang played probably the most pragmatic line. He played the exchange. It's extremely popular at all levels. There are other options, of course. The two main options besides the exchange in the Alekhine, if we go back one move, one is knight f3 here, just developing a knight towards the center in the most classical way and protecting the e-pawn. If black takes here, white will take with the knight and look to expand some point with c4, or look to attack the knight with another very classical developing move, bishop c4. I'm not going to go into too much of the theory and the other variations. I had a recent game in Alekhine's defense where I explained a little bit more about the options for white in the classical main line with knight f3, and the other option, which is after c4, knight b6 is f4, the four pawns attack. And the main line here is d takes e5, d takes e5, knight c6, already starting to try and generate counterplay against white's center. So if knight f3, black will go bishop g4, and for that reason, white mostly protects this double attack d pawn with bishop e3. Note, of course, that d5, knight e5 is completely unplayable. So those are the two main options other than the exchange variation. But the problem with those other options is that black has a wide variety of setups and can impose a lot of different piece formations and pawn structures on white, and white has to be able to play well in all of them. Whereas after the exchange variation, there are really only two options for black, and both of them tend to lead towards relatively natural play from white in the same pawn structure, in either case. So black can take either way. More popular lately has been the more solid, and I would argue passive and just worse, e takes d6. Yeah, I don't really like this variation just stylistically, I think if you're going to play Alekhine's defense and your whole objective is to sort of break down that center, then you should grab that extra center pawn with c takes d6, capture towards the center in the most combative and ambitious fashion. And we'll look at this variation and why perhaps some people have shied away from this recently. But I'll also explain why I don't think black should be shying away from this game, this move at all either. But to take a quick glance at e takes d6, the problem I have with this move is that black is acquiescing to an essentially symmetric pawn structure where white just has slightly more space. I mean, there's nothing really going on here, imbalance-wise, except that white has 2 pawns on the 4th rank and black has a single pawn on the 6th rank. So, yeah, I mean, black just stands a little bit worse, I think, and is a little bit passive. And one example of this is just following the main line a little bit further, knight c3, bishop e7, and most people are going bishop d3 nowadays. The idea, of course, is, number one, you delay bishop g4. You know, you don't allow knight f3, bishop g4, for instance, for at least one more move, and a lot of people put the knight on e2 such that bishop g4 can be met with f3. So just white knows black wants to maybe try and start counterplay against his d4 pawn with bishop g4, and white is just simply not going to allow that to happen. And of course, the bishop d3 is just very active. So normal is knight c6, knight g to e2, castles. By the way, black can go after knight g to e2, bishop g4, but white will just play f3, and bishop h5 castles. And I think normally black plays bishop g6 here. I'm not sure about that. Yeah, bishop g6. The problem if castles, I think, is that knight f4 just wins the bishop pair for nothing now, something like this. And just protecting this d-pawn in some ways is likely slightly better for white, I'm guessing. Yeah, I mean, I somehow don't feel that white should have very many problems if he just wins the 2 bishops and has this extra space for essentially nothing. So black normally castles, and there are quite a few moves here. I think bishop g4, bishop f6, and rook e8 are all playable. Let's confirm with the opening explorer. Yeah, and just one example of typical play is rook e8, b3. So white shores up the c4 pawn just in case. And now a5 is kind of interesting. So black is looking to go a4 and try and build up a little bit of counterplay on the queen side. It's hard to find another plan. Bishop f6 is very natural and possible. But yeah, the position stays essentially statically the same. Bishop e3, very natural stuff. Knight b4. Black tries to nab this bishop, which of course white is never going to allow. And then black goes a4. So it sort of looks like black is working up a little counterplay, and I found this one correspondence game, Nikos Sarakanides versus Paolo Lanzani. And what's funny about this game is that I am sort of casual friends with both of these players. So I was looking for a typical game in the Alekhine's defense, and I found this one correspondence game that was played in a Alekhine's defense thematic tournament between 2 friends. So I know Nikos through Chess Pub and through Correspondence Chess, of course, and Paolo, I just recently played him and actually won in a recent correspondence tournament, and we bonded over our Italian heritage, and he let me practice my very crappy Italian on him, and I still keep up with him a little bit. So shout out to both of those guys. And I think Nikos found a good continuation here, so I'm veering off the beaten path, of course, and this is in no way related to the video. I just thought it was an interesting game. A3, and black's point is that he can play a takes b3, and of course a takes b4, rook takes a1 is not what white wants. So queen takes b3 is the natural move. Now the knight is attacked, of course. Queen b4 is a threat. So after this, and take a second if you want and think about what you might play here as white. Okay, in the game, Nikos played c5, and I think this move very much cements a very easy but steady advantage for white. And after d takes c5, d takes c5, knight d7, white cemented a much better position after rook d1, bishop g5, knight f4, bishop takes, and Yeah, the c5 pawn is sort of cramping, and white has the two bishops in a very open position, some pressure against black's queenside, and I think Nikos eventually pulled this game out as white in a correspondence game. So yeah, I mean, in general, white just scores somewhat better. I think in my database, after knight b4, bishop b1, there are maybe 8 games, and white wins 5 of them, draws 2, and loses 1, scores about 75%. And in general, these positions should just be slightly better for black. And that's one reason I just find them to be slightly better for white, rather. I just find them to be somewhat impalatable for black. This position is just, yeah, slightly worse. So I would not be annotating this game if Kamsky played that way. Kamsky, of course, played c takes d6. I think he was pretty hungry to play some enterprising and combative chess after taking a tough loss to Wesley So, and in general, maybe not playing that great. So I think he was trying to mix it up against one of the younger and perhaps slightly lower rated players in the tournament. So he played something a little bit sharper. So I went knight c3. That's the main move. Black goes g6. Of course, g7 is a very good square for the bishop. And white played the strongest move and signals his intention to enter the so-called Voronezh system with bishop e3. And I'll play out the next couple moves, but I want to rewind a little bit and explain why this system is the most feared system against for the c takes d6 Alekhine exchange. And I think this system is one of the reasons why black has shied away from this variation, at least for a while. So played typically continues bishop g7, now rook c1, exclam, again, castles, very natural moves from black, and b3, exclam from white again. And it's not clear, maybe to most viewers, why the hell white would want to play all of these moves on the queen side, and, you know, some weird sort of non-standard or non-developing moves like b3 or rook c1, etc. So let's go back and take a look at some of the alternatives. So much more natural here would be e7 knight f3, of course. And after bishop g7, perhaps bishop e3, castles, again, very natural moves from black. Bishop e2, and now black is allowed to go bishop g4, and is encouraged to do so, in fact. And just to give you an example of typical play, castles, knight c6, and now black has a small threat. So because of this knight on b6, this bishop on e2 is in fact a little bit overloaded. So you could imagine if it was black's turn, he would play bishop takes f3, and on bishop takes f3, the c4 pawn is hanging. And of course, if bishop takes f3 and bishop takes f3 loses a pawn, then white would have to shatter his kingside pawn structure with this ugly g takes f3. One move before, this isn't a threat because bishop takes f3, knight takes c4, bishop takes b7 would win an exchange. So after knight c6, white is obliged to play b3. And yeah, I mean, here, take a second and think about what you would play as black. So here there's a very critical move for black, d5. A very key break in this specific structure in the exchange Alekhine. And of course, something like c takes d5 is totally insipid for white. Either knight b4, just planning to take on d5, excuse me, with a knight and not expose the queen after queen takes d5, or even just knight takes d5 is fine for black completely. Very reasonable position fighting against this isolated d pawn. So white normally goes c5, and black is basically forced to go knight c8. Of course, if knight d7, then maybe this, or maybe rook c1 first. And d7 is a little bit weak. So normally black goes knight to c8, and after, let's say, h3, black takes on f3, and just defends the threatened d-pawn with e6. And we'll go knight 8 to e7. These positions tend to be equal, but practically even favorable for black. When I look in the database, I notice that black tends to score really quite well here. You notice after rook c1 and queen d2, black is losing almost no games, scoring very well. And even after the main move b4, black scores completely equally. And you can see down here, there's this Eigner-Nakamura game. And let's just follow that game just to illustrate black's chances here. So again, veering a little bit off track, but let's just check it out. I think it's an interesting game nonetheless. So that game continued rook c1, knight a to e7, and white played maybe at first an odd-looking move, knight to e2. But white reasons that black's next move is knight to f5, which would, if the knight was on c3, triple attack the d4 pawn, so he just preemptively defends the d4 pawn. And Aigner plays bishop g4, so I'm guessing he's fully willing to play bishop takes f5 and fracture black's pawn structure and release a little bit of the pressure on this d4 square. And Nakamura says, I don't think so. And if you peek at this position more than a couple seconds, you might realize that h5 or f5 is kind of an irritating threat for white to deal with, because of course h5, bishop f3 rather, knight takes f3 would again fracture white's pawn structure. Excuse me. So Aigner dealt with this threat by playing f4, and after h5, bishop f3. So now knight takes f3, rook takes f3 is white's point. Nakamura developed just queen a5, perhaps threatening the a2 pawn and just getting the queen to an active square. Aigner protects a2 with rook c2, and Nakamura strikes out at the queen side with b6. So of course, c takes b6 would attack the bishop, and Nakamura would be happy to play queen takes b6, adding another attacker to d4, and perhaps Nakamura would play something like a5, a4, or a5, knight b4, etc. Instead, Aigner played g4, and after h takes g4, knight b4, Aigner blundered with bishop d2. And the reason it's a blunder is kind of clever. After b takes c5, rook takes c5, take a second and find the best move for black. Yeah, just a simple removing of the defender with bishop takes d4 check, knight takes d4, queen takes c5, which would win an exchange and a pawn. So after b takes c5, yeah, probably the best move is d takes c5, but that unleashes this massive bishop and leaves black with a 2-0 central pawn advantage, and white, honestly, it's going to be hard for him to keep the c5 pawn on the board probably after just something like rook a to c8 or queen b5 unpinning the knight. Instead, I believe Aigner played bishop takes b4, but after c takes b4, his position, I think bishop h1, rook fc8 was just objectively losing. But just an interesting fragment, and sort of good to note that, you know, Nakamura was willing to play these positions with black. The key thing to note here about this position after knight f3, bishop g7, and just classical development was, number one, that black was pretty easily allowed to play bishop g4 and get this bishop out to a useful square. And number two, after d5, c5, he had the c8 square because his bishop was not on the c8 square, essentially. So you might ask yourself, well, what happens if, let's say, in this position, white plays h3? So white reasons that, okay, we saw what happened in Aigner Nakamura. I'm not going to allow white to play, or black to play bishop g4 rather, and I'm just going to play h3, stop that for good. Okay, so black will still castle, bishop e2, maybe knight c6, castles, bishop f5. Let me close the opening explorer so it's not distracting me. And bishop e3, so normal stuff. Take a second, think about what you'd play as black in this position. Okay, yeah, so again, d5 is good, just equalizing the central space. Again, c takes d5 is extraordinarily lame. After just knight takes, I think, is fine. Even maybe knight b4 is interesting. The difference in this position is that white has not played b3, and so black is free to go knight c4 and fix this knight on b6 and put it onto a very active square. And probably white has to take this thing. I think bishop c1 is actually also possible, but bishop c1... And it's actually kind of cute that b3 is sort of an irritating threat now. But I think when I looked at this, b6, b3, b takes c5 was possible. And after this, c takes d4 Let me make sure I'm not totally insane. Yeah, and the problem here is that, so if we go back, bishop c1, b6, b3, b takes c5. This looks like a psac, and indeed it is, but just for a second, because d3 attacks the bishop and also uncovers an attack on this rook. So kind of an adorable line. But bishop takes c4, d takes c4 is more normal, and after queen takes c4, black secures pretty solid counterplay just with the simple bishop d3, which protects the pawn and attacks the rook. And I think e5 is up next, or queen e8. And this was Lev Milman versus Alexander Shabalov in the World Open 2004. So a pretty solid endorsement again. And Shabalov's an Alekhine's expert. He's been playing it for a really long time. He's of Latvian heritage, and there's some like unwritten rule. If you're Latvian, you must play the Alekhine's defense well. The most notable examples, of course, being Shabalov, but also Kangas and like the patron saint of the Alekhine's defense, Bagirov. So, okay, and so you look at this position and you say, okay, we know if I play knight f3 and I don't play h3, black will play bishop g4 and d5, and c5 will be met by knight c8, e6, knight 8 to e7, and black will be fine. Okay, and if I play h3 and then try to complete my development, black will play d5 and put his knight on the c4 square. So you could ask yourself, all right, what happens if I go maximum amount of prophylaxis and just play, instead of bishop e3 here, I play b3. So the moment black is ready to play d5, now I can play c5, and knight c4 is impossible. Well, okay, I should have turned off the computer and maybe made this a quiz too, but that's okay. So black can play d5 anyway, and on c5, black can actually play knight d7. And take a second, maybe, take a second and just figure out why, after knight takes d5, black isn't just simply losing a pawn. Okay, and here, yeah, the problem is because your rook is still on a1, knight takes c5 exploits this pin. So, of course, d takes c5 hangs the rook, and white is actually in pretty serious trouble here, because if you move the knight, either I can take on d4 right away, or I can even go knight e6 and then take on d4, because d5, bishop takes c3, I'm guessing is good for black. So you notice that black seems just in time to develop this kind of counterplay with develop your light squared bishop somewhere, and then play d5, meeting c5 with knight c8 and rerouting the knight to e7, offloading this light squared bishop, or you just play d5, c5, knight c4, and you secure solid counterplay that way. And it's hard for white to avoid this plan, but white started trying to play this really tricky move order with 7 bishop e3, bishop g7, rook c1, castles, b3, and was scoring points hand over fist with it for a really long time. And you start to notice all of the points. So right now d5 isn't possible because c5, d5, c5, knight cannot go to c8, knight must go here, but now knight takes d5 legitimately wins a pawn because knight takes c5, d takes c5, there's no rook on a1, and the queen protects the knight from the discovered attack. So d5 is out, and the most obvious move perhaps is just knight c6, and this reveals another subtlety of the Voronezh line compared with any of the other lines. Now white can play d5, and conveniently, because the rook is on c1 protecting this knight, bishop takes c3 doesn't win anything. And after knight e5, bishop e2 exclam, we notice a slight problem. So because white has delayed knight f3, there also isn't a way for black to offload this e5 knight. So f4 starts to look like pretty irritating, kind of a big issue now. If f4, knight d7 is the only move, and that completely clogs up black's development and would give white a pretty massive space advantage. And really reduce black to zero counterplay and a lot of suffering. So just to give you an idea, this position scores like 70% or something really, really disgusting for white. And I haven't found any way to theoretically shake this verdict. There are a couple lines, I guess, worth showing just to prove the point. The main move is f5, so after f4, black can go knight g4 now, just adding another protector to the g4 square, essentially. But after bishop g4, f g4, knight e2, for instance. Yeah, I think it's pretty hard for black to generate counterplay, and this knight coming to d4, for instance, is quite annoying. And black has a really ugly pawn structure. Yeah, I mean, one example is Duda versus Varga, Budapest 2013. That went e5. e6 would be the same, because white took ep. Bishop takes e6, and just simply castles. And in the game, Duda just played very simply queen d2, rook c to e1, bishop d4, knight g3, and this d6 pawn, because it's hard for black to play d5, is forever weak, and it's just, yeah, I mean, black has a very bad pawn structure for essentially no compensation. Some people also play rook to e8 and just suffer after f4, knight d7. Not to be recommended. I think even just something like knight f3, knight f6, I think castles is the main move, e6, d takes e6, bishop takes e6. So we'll see in the game that this position, black really wants to angle for d5, get rid of this d6 pawn. But it's just, yeah, in this position, it's really not that easy, and it's probably not going to happen. For instance, bishop d4, d5, c5, and I think knight d7, and I think both knight ge5 and knight b5 to d6 are pretty irritating for black. Yeah, I wouldn't want to play this position for black either. It just looks kind of ugly. There's pretty serious positional problems. So knight c6 has proven after d5, knight e5, bishop e2, with the plan of just very simply f4 has proven to be very difficult for black. And one move that has allowed black to suffer into a lot of draws is e5. After d takes e5, d takes e5, queen takes d8, rook takes d8, c5, knight d7. Yeah, this has been essayed in a lot of games, a lot of correspondence games. People have analyzed it in ChessPub. I think after bishop c4, knight c6, knight f3, h6, stopping all kinds of incursions into the g5 square, perhaps preparing f5 after, moving your king or something. I think white's a little bit better here. His queenside majority, I think, is a little bit more powerful than black's kingside majority, and the plan of just knight e4, d6, and castles followed by putting your pieces on natural squares is fine. Black's development is still kind of clogged up, but this position is also relatively solid for black. White hasn't had an easy time of it when people really knew what they were doing here. But okay, Kamsky played a different move, and I think it's my favorite move in the position. I think it's the best move, and it's the move that Alekhine experts have been playing lately. Kamsky, Nakamura, Baburin, Chetverik. So 9 bishop f5. It took people a long time to stumble upon this move, and it's actually, when you think about it, sort of pretty natural. So sure, you can't, knight c6 is bad because of d5, so you're not playing knight c6 yet. You need to make a useful developing move. Bishop g4 is impossible, so you just go bishop f5. And the one major benefit of this move, I think, that's kind of hidden is that now d5 is again possible, because after c5, knight c8 is available when you're going to go the same plan, e6 and knight 8 to e7. Whew, okay. So now Xiong played, I think, not that great of a move. And I think probably Alekhine's defense took him by surprise, and perhaps he was just thinking about what white does after knight c6, d5. Xiong played d5 himself. And yeah, I think in this specific position, it's just not the best move. Just opening up black's dark square bishop at no real penalty, and because black's knight is not forced to go onto this circuit, I think, for instance, the d7 square or the a6 square are still very reasonable squares for this piece. So d5 doesn't achieve the same amount of, doesn't cause black the same amount of problems here. And if we go back just one move, just to illustrate black's general idea, something like knight f3, d5, c5, knight c8, bishop e2, bishop g4, goes into positions that are essentially identical to Aigner Nakamura, except black is a tempo down, which turns out to be fine because black scores so well in those positions without the lost tempo that losing the tempo to go into these positions is quite fine. For instance, castles, e6, h3, takes, knight 8 to e7, or knight c6. And the positions are very similar to the ones we saw in Aigner Nakamura. White can try to be cagey and play bishop e2 instead, but after d5, c5, knight c8, it's kind of hard to avoid knight f3. So knight f3 would transpose, and bishop f3 is possible, but I think e5 secures black. Good counterplay. I'll leave it at that, actually, because I feel like I'm droning on about Alekhine's theory at this point. So bishop f5, d5. And now Kamsky played, I think, what I would consider to be a dubious move based on my analysis, but it's not super bad. So he played e5. And this is sort of a thematic Alekhine's move, but I think it's slightly less accurate than e6. So in my notes, I have e6, and the idea is similar, just to introduce some central tension and perhaps take on d5, open up the game. You notice one thing about this line for white, of course, is that having played bishop e3, rook c1, knight c3, d5, b3, these are all pawn moves and queenside developing moves, and none of these guys have been touched, and the king is going to be in the center for a long time. So it makes a hell of a lot of sense to open up the e-file. I think the reason why no one plays e6, or that it's not that popular, is because it self-traps the bishop. So you notice that after g4, black is losing a piece. That is sort of an issue if you're not prepared, but after a series of essentially forced moves, bishop takes c3, rook takes c3, bishop e4, attacking the rook, and if white wants to win the piece, f3 is forced. Black can go bishop takes d5, exclam. C takes d5, knight takes d5, and after rook d3, for instance, black has pretty good compensation for the piece. So he's up 2 central pawns. White has played the absolutely hideous f3 and g4, and of course his king, and really none of his pieces have been developed. So there was one game that reached this position, Adair Tim Rakovitz from the British Championships 2010, in which black just simply developed with knight c6, and white found it most prudent to offload and exchange just to try and quench black's initiative. But perhaps slightly more accurate is knight takes e3, rook takes e3, queen h4 check, when white's king has no choice but to take the walk. And I think after something like king d2, rook c8, black has really good compensation. Knight c6 and knight b4 would introduce threats of rook c2, maybe queen f2 at some point is irritating, a5, a4. I think even d5, d4, all of black's pieces will flow into the attack naturally, and black has time to sort of organize an attack because white's king isn't getting much better on d2 because the rook cuts it off, and it'll take white a long time to sort of develop his pieces and coordinate his pieces in any meaningful fashion. So, but Kamsky played e5, and I think the downside the upside is that you don't self-trap your bishop. So something like g4, probably just bishop c8 or bishop d7 is fine. The downside is that white, because you don't introduce any central tension here and you're not really threatening e takes d5, white doesn't have to actually take on e6, or white can settle for a closed game in which he has time to bring his pieces into the attack. And even here, I think it's really interesting to play g4, bishop c8, h4. There was one game that reached this position, Devoirie versus Steffens. Oberwart Open 2004, and black played f5, and white got a pretty raging attack after h5, f4, bishop takes here, takes, and queen c2. I don't even think this position is necessarily bad for black, but I think it's practically very dangerous. And I don't think, I just think certainly that this position is better for white. And if I was black, I would not allow this kind of opportunity with g4, h4, h5, etc. So I think probably, if let's say I was writing a book on Alekhine's defense, which I can assure you I'm not, e6 would be my recommendation. But okay, after e5, Xiong takes on e6 anyway, and Kamsky takes back with the bishop. I think f takes e6 is possible. Do note that, again, g4 is possible. Black would have to be satisfied with something like this, which is maybe something to be satisfied about. But that's not necessary. I think just d takes e6, bishop takes e6 is honestly practically better for black. It's hard for white to stop d5, and with the center opening up, white has some serious problems with his development. And Xiong played a novelty. Xiong played knight g to e2. Very natural, but I think in all of the games that reached this position, white played knight f3. Yeah. So knight g to e2 is just either playing knight d4 or knight f4 as the final square for the knight instead of just f3. But again, this takes one more move, whereas knight f3 just prepares a bishop move right away. Knight g to e2, while perhaps d4 and f4 are more purposeful squares for the knight, this also takes another tempo. And take a second, if you want, and think about what you would play here as black. Okay, Kamsky ripped open the center right away with d5, exclam. And there are some tactical points here. I mean, it sort of looks like maybe c takes d5 is good, right? But I think... no, c takes d5 here just simply knight takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, knight f4, attacking the bishop, bishop c6, and queen takes d8, rook takes d8. I think this is essentially equal for white and probably the way white should have gone. But maybe Xiong was a little bit leery of allowing black's bishop such scope in an open position where he hasn't finished development yet. It does look a little risky, but I think after maybe even just f3 and king f2 or just bishop c4 right away that white should be essentially equal. But instead, Xiong played c5, and I think this is at least dubious. It's also worth noting here that black could delay d5 for one move with knight c6, and after knight f4, break out with d5 again. And probably Kamsky did not elect to go this way, maybe because he wasn't clear what black should do after, or maybe he just didn't see that d5 was possible. The point is that after c takes d5, black can give up the bishop with bishop takes c3, rook takes c3, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, and white actually has some relatively serious problems in this position, I think. Queen a5 and rook a d8 is going to be irritating. It's hard to develop this light square bishop because of the pressure on g2. Rook e8 is coming. Yeah, this position is pretty ugly for white. And so probably going back here, c takes d5 would be an inaccuracy, and white has to play something else. Maybe knight f takes d5. But bishop takes d5, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, c takes d5, knight b4. Hitting both d5 and a2 is, again, just better for black. I mean, with the game opening up, with white's king still in the center, with this massive bishop, black can never really be worse in these positions. But okay, d5 was the game, and Xiong played c5. So, again, I think it's worth the quiz here to decide what you'd play as black. And if you were following the Lee chess computer, you might have been fooled. I think Kamsky played the absolute best move, knight c6 double exclam, in my opinion. Very much in the spirit of this position. So you can see that, I've talked about this a billion times already, it's probably getting kind of annoying, that white's kingside development is really clogged up. And so whatever black can do to open up the game and try to explode the position and exploit this lead in development and white's king in the center, he should do it. And this move might not occur to you right away until you see that just the obvious c takes b6, which looks like it loses a piece at one ply. Black regains the piece immediately with d4 and rips open the game completely. So something like knight takes d4, maybe even bishop takes d4, bishop takes d4, knight takes d4 leaves white much worse. So the point is that after something like bishop d3, let's say, well, first of all, b takes a7, rook e8, bishop e2, probably forced. Bishop f5 is extremely bad for white. And if it's not clear, white cannot get his king onto the center yet because of knight takes e2 check. Knight takes e2. Queen takes e2, of course, is a blunder because the rook protects it. And queen takes d1 wins the knight on e2. And if something like bishop d3, just developing a piece, queen takes b6 is just slightly better for black. White, I think, can castle here, but after rook a to d8, black has this monster knight on d4. Very active, well-placed pieces, and yeah, absolutely no problems. So I think in the game, Xiong was reluctant to probably take on b6 and open up the game further with this. And so he played knight d4, getting ready for something like bishop e2 or maybe bishop b5, while also stopping d4. But this move is a mistake. Probably close to a losing mistake. So take a second and see if you can find what black played here. Okay, Kamsky played another absolutely brilliant and counterintuitive move. He played bishop takes d4 double exclam. Again, my opinion. You're at the mercy of my annotations when you watch my videos, and I think this move is double exclam. Okay, and so of course bishop takes d4 is forced. And okay, maybe take a second and quiz yourself once again on what you'd play as black here. Okay, Kamsky played the very obvious rook e8. Well, the very natural rook e8. Of course, lining up the rook along the open file and threatening something like maybe bishop g4 with a discovered attack. But this move turns out to be slightly inaccurate. Maybe, well, probably just a mistake. It turns out that queen h4 is probably winning on the spot. It's not that easy and the positions are pretty unclear, but probably objectively, like let's say you gave this to two computers to play in a bunch of games, or you gave this to two correspondence players, probably white is objectively going to lose after queen h4. And the point is, okay, well, first, just the bishop is double attacked. So if you just move the bishop, d4 is just going to rip white completely to shreds here. If c takes, then just d takes, and because of this pin, white is in a hell of a lot of trouble. And of course, if you just, I mean, moving the bishop, I'm just going to take on c3, or I just move the knight, and you're in a ton of trouble. So probably the only move is similar to what Xiong played in the game, knight e2, trying to maintain white's hold on the d4 square and keep the d4 break contained, while also kind of blocking the e-file. The problem is that with knight e2, you completely, again, stunt your kingside development. And so here, black can just play very calmly knight d7. And for instance, if white plays in the game, as in the game with queen d2, maybe just bishop f5 or rook fe8 even. And it's not easy at all for black to unwind. I don't see how white actually defends this position. Something like what Xiong played in the game with king d1, rook e8, just very simple chess, bringing all your pieces into the attack. Note that black is coincidentally threatening rook takes e2, removing the defender of the d4 square. Yeah, I mean, and honestly, it's just hard to even suggest a move because rook takes e2 is such a strong threat. Moving the bishop just allows d4, and just as a simple example, bishop g5, queen takes f2. Black is down no material now, so contrary to the game where we see similar positions to this one where white has been allowed to take the knight on b6, black has gotten everything from the game at no material investment. So white's king is on d1, utter crap of a square. He has this strong pawn on d4. White has a really hard time developing his kingside, and so on. So I think this was the key moment in the game, and the absolute most critical moment in the game, and Kamsky blundered with rook e8. It looks completely natural, but it turns out actually that Xiong can just grab on b6. And this is the type of move that like a young 15-year-old chess player will play. Like he's been analyzing with computers his whole life. He's an absolute monster at calculation, and he just goes, all right, you know what? I'm going to take. He sees that he's not losing immediately. And from here, honestly, Xiong plays absolutely wonderful and amazing defense. So after c takes b6, note that if you guys were looking at this and you thought, okay, rook e8, c takes b6, bishop g4 check is just a slaughter, actually, white might just be winning after bishop e2. It's not easy to find an actual continuation here. So the threat is just simply castles, and If you try and strand white's king in the center, for instance, bishop e2, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, all these moves are forced. Queen e7, for instance, threatening mate. Just queen d2, and yeah, I just think black has simply nothing here, just like rook c2, for instance, in castles, or, yeah. Black has to trade off too many pieces to strand white's king in the center, for instance, is really what it comes down to. And I honestly can't find anything here. If queen h4 instead, threatening takes, and then knight takes, discovering an extra attacker, just castles. And if bishop e2, knight takes e2, rook e2, queen e2, knight d4, yeah, this just really doesn't do it for white. Or for black, rather. He's just down an exchange in a relatively clarified position, and yeah, it's just not very good. So after rook e8, black actually has to play relatively precisely to maintain his initiative. So white grabs, and Kamsky plays queen h4 now. So he sees the idea. He sees that he needs to fight for the d4 square to get this d4 pawn push going and generate some pressure. But here, it's not really the same, and the position is not the same as earlier for a very clever reason. So in the earlier positions, if we go back, for instance, queen h4, knight e2, bishop f5, queen d2, rook fe8, for instance. Oh, sorry, rather, whoops, queen h4, knight e2, knight d7. Queen here, bishop f5. In these positions, black can play a little bit slower with moves like bishop f5, rook e8, etc. There's kind of a cute idea here that prevents black from doing the same in these exact positions. So after knight e2, first of all, well, notice that similarly, just bishop e3 moving the bishop out of this double attack just allows d4, forking these two pieces and winning the piece back. So that move is completely out of the question. So white is essentially forced to play knight e2, and this also looks really bad for white. And practically, it is really bad for white. I mean, to defend this position against Kamsky, down a piece, but with this massive amount of pressure and this absolutely bungled kingside, is extremely difficult. And that's one of the things that makes this game so amazing, is that Xiong hangs on for so long and plays just like an absolute a beast. So notice here that after knight e2, like a very natural move would be bishop g4. And of course, the threat is very obvious. Bishop takes e2, knight d4. Or just bishop takes e2, queen d4. So we're just threatening to remove one defender of this d4 bishop. And of course, if you move the bishop now, just d4 again, or yeah, something similar. So take a second and see if you can find out what white should play here. Yeah, so white has this absolutely bizarre resource, and it's only because the c file is open. It's not even that black has now down this knight on d7, or that he's down a piece at all. Just rook takes c6, exclam, removing an attacker from the d4 square. So after something like b takes c6, there's no real threat anymore. Bishop e2, and the bishop is defended once, and yeah, just because this knight is not on c6, white can actually even afford to take on a7. And now, even worse, this a7 pawn really sort of ties down black's rooks to the back rank, and white is objectively winning. I think eventually something simple like queen d3, f3, king f2, or, you know, f3, king d1, queen d3, king d1, etc., white will consolidate, because there's no real way to budge this bishop from the absolutely massive d4 square. So black now has these incredibly weak dark squares, and it's not really easy to budge this bishop. And a similar thing happens after just bishop f5, which would be a very natural move and is consistent with our other variations with the immediate queen h4. Just opening up the e-file and, you know, getting ready to sort of generate extra threats with, like, let's say knight b4 to d3 or to c2 or takes a2, etc. So, but again, rook takes c6, b takes c6, b takes a7, and this bishop is defended, and white is ready to consolidate in some sort of weird fashion where it's just the material is reduced enough that it's hard for black to find more attackers and throw more wood on the fire. So completely amazing. The only real move here for black is a takes b6. So eliminating b takes a7 in a lot of positions, opening up the rook on this a2 pawn, etc. And already it's starting to get a little bit hard for white to find moves. So now probably something like bishop f5 or bishop g4 is a little bit more serious of a threat. And like, for instance, rook b6 right away makes literally no sense because, yeah, now c5 is threatened, rook takes a2 is threatened, and I think white's in a lot of trouble, actually. Similarly, after a takes b6, I mean, what else do you play? Xiong played queen d2 in the game, which is, I think, the best move. But, yeah, again, it's not easy to find ways to sort of unwind your king side. If g3, queen e4 would attack the rook on h1. You can't move this knight. Rook c2 looks like kind of a natural move, defending a2, defending the knight on e2. But I think even here, something like bishop f5, just a simple attack and opening up the e-file. Very natural chess, rook d2, knight b4 is extremely irritating for white. Just threatening a2, perhaps threatening knight c2 check. Knight c2 check is actually a massive threat here, isn't it? So yeah, that would be quite an issue. So Xiong plays, I think, the only move and the correct move, again, defending very well with queen d2. And after bishop f5, so very similar to what we've seen before. Xiong plays, again, extremely accurately, king d1. So note that in this position after bishop f5, we have a similar threat as before, with just simple rook takes e2, bishop takes e2, knight d4, winning a piece. Or winning 2 pieces for the rook. And black would still be down in exchange in this position, but he would have a pawn for it, and still a pretty massive attack and a lot of threats. So white removes the knight from the pin and just sort of gets ready to to kind of hunker down here. Note that something like bishop takes b6, I think knight b4 here is just pretty crushing. So now that the bishop's not on d4, the queen actually protects the b4 square, and one of these pieces capturing on a2 or knight d3 check is a pretty serious threat. Maybe even d4, d3 at some point. So again, Xiong finds the best move and plays king d1. Of course, rook e2, bishop e2, knight takes d4, and Xiong plays f3. It actually is worth noting here that queen takes d4 is possible, and it's not intuitive at all to trade queens when black is down in exchange, but actually after queen takes d4, knight d4, it's remarkably hard for white to hold his position together. So black already has one pawn for the exchange, and white's king is a mess, but he also has pressure on this a2 pawn that white can't actually stop in any meaningful way. So, of course, a4, knight takes b3, rook a1, knight takes b3 anyway, exploiting the pin. And yeah, if a2 falls, that's going to be pretty uncomfortable. There's also a relatively cute tactic here. a4, knight takes b3, rook c3, and now rook takes a4, winning the next pawn, because rook takes b3, rook a1 check wins this rook on h1. So if not that, then what? Maybe bishop f3, but takes, rook takes a2, I think is arguably just clearly better for black at this point. Black has 2 pawns for the exchange. White is supremely uncoordinated and passive. This bishop is very powerful. This d-pawn is very powerful. And it's likely that black is going to win another pawn or two, because b3, f2, f3, h2 are all extremely weak. So, yeah, I mean, even Stockfish in exchange up prefers black. So queen takes d4 was interesting and maybe was a better try, but it's not easy to see this position or muster up the courage maybe to play this if you don't see all the way through. So Kamsky plays the far more natural knight takes, and Xiong plays f3, just removing queen takes f2 as an option. And this is a critical position, I think. If you really analyze this, I would encourage you guys to take a second and really analyze this, or play it out against a computer, or just analyze it with an engine. take a look at the live commentary on this position, it's really not at all easy now, even though the king is on d1, to break through for black. A2 is defended. White has a pretty solid cluster of pieces around his king now. And really, there's kind of like a little bit of lack of harmony in black's forces now. The knight on d4 is powerful, but it's not really doing anything. The d pawn is useful, but really black wants to get this thing moving, but the knight's in the way. The queen on h4 is okay, but it's, kind of off on the side. And yeah, I tried to find very clear improvements on Kamsky's play, and I couldn't really do it. And if you look now, Stockfish, instead of being like completely winning after, the early queen h4 line, it's really not at all clear now. And Kamsky dove in here with queen f2. And I don't think this is a bad move at all, but I also maybe don't think it's the most accurate. And I think Xiong mentioned during the broadcast that he didn't find it the most accurate either, because in a few moves, Kamsky's forced to go back to h4, and that makes queen f2 to maybe look a little bit imprecise. Stockfish recommends bishop d7, which is an interesting idea, and it's sort of... I'm going to essentially leave it at bishop d7 because it's not all that easy to understand. But in a lot of positions, it wants to go bishop c6 and either knight f5 and d4, or knight e6, d4, or knight e6, knight f4. And the bishop on c6 tends to be a little bit more active than on e6, where it ends up after d4. It stops rook c7, and after d4 it generates useful pressure down the long diagonal, I think is really mainly it. And the engine tends to prefer this move, but it's actually not really easy to tell if it's legitimately better than queen f2 or not, or any other try, maybe even bishop e6 here. Similar to what Kamsky played, except not going into f2 is also worth considering. But I think engines and Kamsky both realize that at some point, black needs to move this knight, reposition it, and push d4. So Kamsky sets about doing just that. So he plays queen f2 first, just trying to be a little bit annoying. After rook e1, Kamsky plays bishop e6, so he's getting ready to move this knight, perhaps to f5 or to c6, and then go d4. Xiong goes rook c3, so just lifting a rook up into useful position. Maybe at some point queen e3 is possible. Maybe rook d3 is a threat. Kamsky goes knight c6, either knight b4 or just simply d4 at some point is the idea. Bishop f1, and now Kamsky, in lieu of trading queens, goes queen h4. I was wondering during the game if queen takes d2 check, king takes d2, rook takes a2 check, rook c2, and now rook a3 was possible. And white should probably protect the pawn by going rook b2. And black's up 2 pawns for the exchange and is pretty solid. It's not clear maybe how white's going to make progress, but it seems kind of risky. I mean, probably black is never winning this, and when you're down the exchange like this, it's probably a little bit risky to trade queens. So Kamsky plays the much more human and much more practical queen h4. With white's king in the center, I think it makes more sense to just keep the queens on the board and try and work up some pressure. Xiong plays bishop b5, of course, just threatening to snap on c6. Kamsky goes knight d4, attacking the bishop. Players are just kind of maneuvering slowly, jockeying for position, and Kamsky goes knight f5. I'm going to turn this thing off. Xiong goes rook d3, and Kamsky achieves d4. So now with this d4 pawn, black has succeeded, I think, in securing adequate counterplay for the exchange. A2 is still a weakness. This pawn on d4 is very cramping and severely limits the scope of white's rook. And of course, white's coordination is awful. His king is still in the center. Long term, it's just going to be extremely hard for white to make any progress here. Kamsky mentioned this in the after game interview. It's just, if he simply even sits here and does nothing, it's essentially just going to be a draw no matter what. So you can see that engines think it's around equal, and if he does nothing, it's just simply going to remain equal. Just like, put a rook on d8, shuffle your rook around, or king g7, h5, queen f6, or whatever. Just making useful natural moves, Kamsky's not going to lose this game because it's just impossible for Xiong to get his king to safety and utilize this extra exchange. So he's just simply under far too much pressure. It is worth noting here what happens after queen takes h2. Ah, dang it. I was going to make it a quiz, but I stupidly forgot to turn off the engine. So it does look like in this position for a while that the h2 pawn is hanging, and maybe at some moments Kamsky could have taken it. But in this specific position, there's g4 with a double attack on h2 and f5. So black would be forced to trade queens here, and after something like, let's say this, white would be, I think, in this position clearly better. So without the queens, I think exchange up, it becomes a little bit easier for white to consolidate his king position, the a2 weakness, and start putting these rooks to work on maybe the c file or the e file or the h file even. So queen takes h2 would be a pretty serious blunder here, I think. Kamsky wisely avoids this and just plays the very natural d4. Xiong goes g3. Kamsky retreats very simply with queen f6. And yeah, again, Xiong finds a pretty magnificent defensive idea here. He heads back to the king side with king e2. And after bishop d7, so threatening the cheapo peeking around the corner with bishop d7 with a pin, he goes a4, stops it, and Kamsky rips open the queen side with b5. Xiong, of course, cannot take this because bishop b5, and bishop b takes a4 is threatened, so a5 is mostly forced, and Kamsky just goes bishop c6 here. So it starts to look like f3 is critically weak, and maybe king e2 is just kind of a blunder. But after king f2, white is just in time after knight e3 to go bishop e2, and now his king is really quite safe on f2. And I think black is still equal, has no problems, but again, Xiong, I think, is, at least as far as king safety goes and pressure against his king, he's mostly safe. And now it's just a question of whether or not he can kind of unwind, maybe put pressure on this d4 pawn, and try and make use of his extra exchange. If we go back a second, when I was analyzing this game, I thought b4 looked kind of interesting. The idea, of course, is that bishop b5 is again a threat, and rook takes a5 is also a threat now that b4 cuts out the queen's defense of a5. And if queen takes b4, bishop c6, king f2, knight e3. Now knight e3 actually comes with a double threat of knight c2 and queen takes f3. And, of course, now bishop e2 just protecting against one just allows knight c2. So in this variation, black is actually just winning his exchange back by force, and I think secures very reasonable counterplay. And I probably should draw this position relatively easily by just picking up the weak a pawn at some point. So I think it was worth considering this, and this was probably the most forcing solution to black's problems. If he just wanted to draw now, sensing that maybe white is out of the worst of it, b4 was an interesting option. Okay, but in the game, Kamsky just played, again, very simply, rook d8, and after king g1, it becomes clear that it's not actually all that easy for either player to improve their position. So this d4 pawn and really this queenside construction stop the rooks from ever really being effective. There's no open lines. The d pawn is extremely cramping, as is the knight on e3. White's king is weak enough such that this bishop can never really abandon this f3 pawn. And yeah, I mean, black's pieces are very active and well placed. And so really, if black just sits here, white can make no real progress. I don't see a way to do anything. And so you'll notice this is just a plain zero evaluation. It's not easy for, I think engines see that both players are going to have to essentially shuffle their pieces around and do nothing. So Kamsky plays king g7. Xiong plays bishop d1. Again, both players aren't really doing much of anything. It's also worth considering, given that later in the game, maybe the fact that the king is on the long diagonal is a tactical issue, that maybe just the waiting move h5 is better. h5 is just a common slow improving move, but maybe also at some point black can use this pawn to try and continue the initiative against white's king. I think this is probably a slightly better move for black, but it doesn't much matter. King g7, bishop d1, and now Kamsky played bishop takes f3. So take a second and decide what you'd play here as white. Okay. Yeah, this move was actually a horrific blunder, and absolutely broke my heart to see this move. It's, man, I mean, I would tell you to look up the footage on the U.S. Chess Champs website of Kamsky's reaction when he played this move. So his reaction to this move is on video and is documented, and he's just so heartbroken. And deservedly so, because honestly, in so many ways, this game was absolutely brilliant from him. This whole knight c6, queen h4 conception, and this exchange sacrifice, and the missed opportunities, and the remarkable defense by Xiong in a really tough position. But he just blows it in one move. And I'm honestly, even looking at this game still, I'm not sure what he missed, because this bishop takes f3 loses to multiple moves, and it loses to like multiple obvious captures, and so it's just hard to sort of understand what was happening here. So, the site's getting updated. So the win that Xiong chose was bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, and rook e takes e3. And the point, of course, is that queen takes e3 loses a queen. The only advisable recapture is d takes e3, and white can't take on d8 right away, of course, because d2 is hanging, but he can flick in the in-between move queen b2. Very unfortunately for Kamsky, check. So maybe Kamsky missed queen b2 check, except that also winning was just plain old rook takes d4, when rook takes d8 and rook takes e3 are both threats, and rook takes d4, queen takes d4 is with check again, and so this knight hangs for nothing, and white wins a rook. So I'm honestly not sure what Kamsky missed here. It is worth noting for those of you who thought perhaps that queen f2 was winning, it's not. So maybe you thought something like bishop c6. Oh no, it's updating. We got disconnected. Hold on, maybe. Okay, I'm back. Maybe something like bishop c6, takes, and takes here with this pin. This looks incredibly enticing at first. And even you might have even seen fancier moves. Takes here check, takes here, and then rook e takes e3, exploiting this pin, winning an exchange. This doesn't totally work, though, because of the intermediate move bishop c2. And after rook takes rook d2, just bishop f5. And white is probably not going to win this endgame. He is up in exchange, but black has this strong d-pawn for it, and black's bishop is good, his king is more active, and yeah, I think this is probably a theoretical draw. So queen f2 is not a win, but it's probably the only move that's not winning. Yeah, and after this sequence, Kamsky very sadly resigned. And yeah, again, he mentioned in the press conference what's even sadder is that just any waiting move here is just fine for black, like h5 or rook d7 or rook d6, for instance, just a move that doesn't really change the status quo. I'd probably play h5, and you can see if you turn on the engine, it even thinks maybe black has some slight chances here, but objectively, this is going to be a draw, and black has just absolutely no problems here. He just felt like he was pressing the whole game, and he was possibly winning at some point. These are his words, and he just overpressed. You see a lot of times in chess, it's people can't adjust when the evaluation of the position sort of changes out of their favor. So at some point, Kamsky was winning. He was sort of the mindset that he just needed to put Xiong away. He needed to finish the game. And Xiong defended like a freak, and just Kamsky saw his advantage slowly dissipate, and he still wanted to push, and he just blundered with bishop f3. He just had some kind of a meltdown, and Xiong very quickly, hopped on the blunder and finished Kamsky off. And what could have been, honestly, an amazing brilliancy and perhaps the best game of the tournament went to hell in a handbasket in one single move. And, I also think as a takeaway from this game, like, Kamsky missed a win earlier with Queen H4, and Xiong was out of the opening really quite out of his opening preparation really quite early and played kind of poorly. Made this mistake with Knight D4. Like, even the best players make mistakes, and you shouldn't get down on yourself if you blunder in one move. I mean, Kamsky's Bishop F3 is essentially as close to a one-move blunder as you can get at the highest level. Don't get down on yourself. Everyone has these mental slips, and everyone buckles under pressure, and everyone has a hard time keeping their nerves under control during tough games. It's just a part of chess, and it's just a game. You got to keep fighting, and hopefully, not only was this game a good review of, like, let's say, the exchange Alekhine theory, a good illustration of how you should keep playing with the maximum amount of energy when you have the initiative, and with the king in the center, how to play against, how to generate an attack with an opponent's king in the center, how to open up lines, playing an exchange down, keeping lines closed, how to maximize the minor pieces potential against the exchange, etc. How to not trade queens when you're down. There are a lot of how to not trade queens when you're down material. There are a lot of instructive things about this game, even though it ended really abruptly. I think it was just a great game. I think it was a good game to kick off me annotating some top games. I'd like to do this more often. I think this game helped me a lot, just preparing my notes for it and then, regurgitating all of my findings to you guys. Okay, well, I want to stop rambling. I hope you liked it. If I'm inspired by any other games in the US Champs, I'll certainly be back with another annotation. If not, expect some more rapid games soon, and I know I promised you guys an E6 Sicilians video and an Endgames video. I promise those will come out sooner rather than later. So, bye guys, hope you enjoyed it. See you again soon.